into that and show you how to add relationships and stuff. But we would send something like this. It would go to our GraphQL API, which only has a single endpoint. So instead of having all these different routes, we're just sending it to this /GraphQL. And then the response data is going to include only what we asked for in our query, which in this case would look something like this, where we have our project, we're just getting the name, and then we have the client of that project, and we're only getting the name from that as well. Okay, so you can see how it's much more targeted than a REST API. So let's just look at this query one more time. Again, we're just asking for the client with the ID of 100, and we want the name of the project and the client. That's the response. And notice how it looks very similar to JavaScript, just looks like a JavaScript object, and it looks very similar to the response. So learning the syntax for queries and also mutations, which I'll talk about next, is actually really simple, especially if you're a JavaScript developer. I think that's why a lot of JavaScript developers they're more into seems like they're more into GraphQL than other languages. All right, now to add data to the server or to update or delete, we'd use something called mutations. So mutations are formatted very similar to queries, and this is an example here. We use the keyword mutation, and then we're calling this one add project, and inside the parentheses here is where we add our data. So in this case, we're adding a name of mobile application, a description, a status, and a client ID. And just like with the queries, in our curly braces, we're specifying what we want to get back. Okay, what do we want back from this mutation that we're making? And in this case, we're asking for the name, description, and status, and that's exactly what we get back. All right, so that's mutations. Now, when you're working on in your back end, for instance, when you're building a REST API, you usually use a tool like Postman, at least that's what I use, to make HTTP requests to your server while you don't have a front end. So in this case with GraphQL, there's actually a tool that comes with your GraphQL server called Graphical or GraphIQL. And it allows us to do just what I showed you. It allows us to make queries. In this case, we're saying we want the project with this ID, name, and client. That's what we get back. And we can also do mutations, and we also have access to our history, so we can make past queries. So it's a very handy tool and something we'll be using a lot in the first half. Now, GraphQL servers have a schema that specifies all the fields as well as their types. Okay, GraphQL is a strongly typed language. And the most basic component of GraphQL schemas are object types. So anytime we have a resource, such as a project or a client or a blog post, recipe, anything like that, we're going to create an object type. So in our case, we're going to have a project and client object type. And then we also have scalar types, such as string, int, float, boolean, and ID, which is a unique identifier. So you can see how that's formatted here. All right, so we'll be getting into that. There's other types we'll be using as well, such as enum and lists. There's a whole bunch of types to get familiar with. Now, when it comes to setting up GraphQL, there's a lot of different ways to do it, a lot of different technologies. What we'll be using is a package called Express GraphQL, which is a GraphQL server for Node.js with tools to use it with Express. There's also Apollo Server, which is another popular tool that you can use, and a lot of people use that with other JavaScript frameworks as well. And then there's even content management systems such as GraphCMS that will allow you to create a GraphQL API. So they're kind of like Sanity.io or Strapi, but instead of a REST API, they give you a GraphQL API. In fact, Strapi can also do GraphQL as well. A lot of them can. So this is just an overall look at the stack that we'll be using. I know it looks like a lot. Try not to let it intimidate you, but it's really not too bad. So the server is where we'll be starting, and we'll be creating just an Express server, initialize Express. We're going to listen on a certain port, and we're going to first of all, just deal with data in a JavaScript file before we get to the database, just so I can show you how to set up GraphQL. We want to set up the GraphQL endpoint. We want to create our schema, create our queries, and we're going to be using the graphical client. Okay, then we're going to hook up a database. So we're going to be using MongoDB along with Atlas, which allows us to use MongoDB in the cloud. And then we'll use Mongoose to connect to MongoDB, as well as create our database models. Okay, once we're done with the server, we're going to start on the front end. I'm using React, but again, you can use whatever you'd like. Certain endpoint of a REST API. And REST API, they give you a graph object. An overall look at this certain endpoint of a REST API. In our current REST API object, the GraphQL endpoint. We want to create our schema, create our queries, and we're going to be using the graphical client. Okay, then we're going to hook up a database. So we're going to be using MongoDB along with Atlas, which allows us to use MongoDB in the cloud. And then we'll use Mongoose to connect to MongoDB as well as create our database models. Okay, once we're done with the server, we're going to start on the front end. I'm using React, but again, you can use whatever you'd like. And we're using the Apollo client to query our GraphQL API. All right, and then finally, I'm just going to use Bootstrap for the UI and for the styling. Okay, so that's kind of an overall look at our application. All right, so enough with the slides. Hopefully, this at least gives you the gist of how GraphQL works. So now we're going to get into it and start on our project. All right, guys, so now that we talked a little bit about what GraphQL is and we looked at queries and mutations and so on, now we're going to start coding. And this is a page from the documentation that basically shows us how to set up a GraphQL server with Express, which is a Node.js backend JavaScript framework. And I'm assuming that you guys have just some very basic knowledge in Express. At the very least, maybe you watch my Express crash course. That's fine. You don't have to be a master in it. So there's three main things that we need to install. That's going to be the Express framework, GraphQL, and then there's also a package to basically connect them together, which is Express GraphQL. And then we essentially need to just bring those in. We create a basic Express server. And then instead of having all these different endpoints, all these different routes, as if we were creating a REST API, we basically have one endpoint, and that's going to be this /GraphQL, and that's where we run this GraphQL HTTP server, and that gets passed in a schema. And your schema can be one large file, or it can be broken up into you can put your queries into a separate file or your mutations, etc. We're going to start off just having it all in one file just to avoid confusion, but at the end, we'll probably break it up into smaller chunks. So now we're going to open up VS Code, and I just have a completely empty folder here called Project Management App. And first of all, we're going to just run an npm init-y, which will just create a package.json file. And then let's install our dependencies. So we know we want Express. We want Express-GraphQL. We want GraphQL itself, if I spell it right. And then there's a couple other things I want to install. One is going to be Mongoose, because we are using MongoDB as our database later on. So Mongoose will help us connect, and we'll create our database models and so on. And then I'm also going to set up cores and an optional package called colors, which I'm going to use later on. So let's install those as just our main dependencies. And then I have a couple dev dependencies as well. So npm install -D. We want nodemon so that it'll constantly watch our files and we don't have to keep restarting after we make a change. And then I'm also going to install .env, which will allow us to have a .env file to define all of our environment variables. Now what we want to do is create a folder for our server, which is going to be our GraphQL API. So everything that has to do with that, including our models and queries, our schema, all that stuff will go in here. And then later on, we'll have a client folder for React, or even if you wanted to use Vue or something else. So in server, let's create an index.js. That's basically our entry point. And then we're going to create just a simple Express server here. I do have GitHub Copilot on, but I might shut it off because it might get too distracting. But let's create an app variable. We're going to initialize Express. And then we're going to listen on a port. So let's actually create a port variable here. And I'm going to actually change this to 5,000. So it's going to first look in our environment variables for a port variable, which we don't have just yet, but I'll create that now. So in the root, I'm going to create a .env file. And then in here, we're going to have a variable of port, and we're going to set that to 5,000. Okay, let's also add a node_env and set that to development. All right, and then in order for that to work, we do have to require the .env extension, so we can simply do require and .env and then just add .config. So we call that config method. And just to test it out, I'll actually put this to something different. Let's do 8,000. All right, and then we'll finish this up. So we want to listen. Let's do app.listen on that port, and then I'm going to do a console.log, and let's just say we'll say server running on port, and then we'll just put variable in here of port. All right, so now to actually run this, we're going to create an npm script. So in our package.json, let's change that to start. And then we're going to have that run node, and then make sure we go into our server folder and then index.js. And then to use nodemon, we'll copy that down and we'll set this to nodemon, and we'll change the name of the script to dev. All right, so let's go ahead and try this out. If we say npm run dev, okay, so now you'll see it says server running on port 8000. So we know it's reading it from the environment variable. If it wasn't, then it would use 5000. Now I'm going to stop this with Command or Control C, and I'm going to change this to 5 because that's what I want to use. I just wanted to test it out first. So we are going to change that to 5000, and then we can go ahead and run that again. All right, now as far as GraphQL goes, we want to bring in, we'll go right here, and let's say const, and we want to bring in GraphQL HTTP. So let's say GraphQL HTTP, and that is going to come from Express GraphQL, that package that we installed. And then actually, I'm sorry, this should be a lowercase q. Yeah, so it should be like that. And then let's go down above where we have our app.listen, and we're going to create our app.use. And in here we want to pass in, just like we saw in the documentation, we have our GraphQL endpoint, and then we want, just like Copilot's telling us, we want to do our HTTP. Let's see, we're going to need that. All right, now in here we need to require a schema, which obviously we don't have yet, but we're going to create a file in the server folder. Let's create another folder called schema, and inside that folder we're going to create a file called schema.js. Now, like I said earlier, you can separate all your queries and mutations and stuff into separate files, but for now we're just going to put everything in this one JavaScript file. And then here we want to pass in, well, first we want to bring in the schema. So let's go right here. Let's say const schema, and we're going to set that to require the schema file that's in the schema folder, and then we can simply pass that in here. Okay, and if you called your schema file something else, then you would put, you would do this and then whatever the file name. But yeah, we want our schema, and then there's a tool called Graphical, which I do want to be able to use in development. So we need to set that here, and this is GraphIQL, Graphical. And instead of just setting it to true, I want to set it to true if we're in development. So we'll say process.env, and then check our node env value. And if that is equal to development, then this will be true. Okay, so that way if we were to change it to production, then this would not be set to true, it would be false. Okay, now as far as our schema goes, we need some data to work with, and this could be from anywhere. When you use GraphQL, your data can be anything. We're going to start off with it just being in a JavaScript file, but it could be in a MongoDB database, as we're going to do later. It could be in a Postgres. Postgres database. It could be just anywhere, any kind of database you can think of or store you can think of, you can use that. So I have a file in the repository in the description called sample data. So I'm going to bring that in, or I'm going to, in the server folder here, I'm going to add that, and I'm going to call this sample data.js. And you can just bring it right in from the repo, but I'm going to just copy the content from it and paste it in. So basically, we just have two arrays. One is projects, and you'll see the projects have an ID, a client ID, a name, a description, and a status. Okay, and I have, 5 of them. So 5 different projects, and then we also have clients. So here we have an ID, a name, and as our schema goes, we need some data to work with, and this could be from anywhere. When you use GraphQL, your data can be anything. We're going to start off with it just being in a JavaScript file, but it could be in a MongoDB database, as we're going to do later. It could be in a Postgres database. It could be just anywhere, any kind of database you can think of or store you can think of, you can use that. So I have a file in the repository in the description called sample data. So I'm going to bring that in, or I'm going to, in the server folder here, I'm going to add that, and I'm going to call this sample data.js. And you can just bring it right in from the repo, but I'm going to just copy the content from it and paste it in. So basically, we just have two arrays. One is projects, and you'll see the projects have an ID, a client ID, a name, a description, and a status. Okay, and I have, 5 of them. So 5 different projects, and then we also have clients. So here we have an ID, a name, an email, and a phone number. And there's 5 clients. There's basically, 1 client per project. And then we're just exporting those arrays. So this is what we're going to use for our data, just for now, just to make some queries and show you how we can set things up. Now we want to bring that data in, so I'm just going to destructure from that file. I want to get the projects array and the clients array. So we want to say require from, and we're going to go up 1 level into sample data.js. So that's going to bring in the projects and clients for us to work with. So from GraphQL, there's actually a lot of different things we want to bring in. So there's a couple ways we can do it. We can set this GraphQL variable to require, and then anything that we want to bring in from it, we're going to destructure. All right. Now, instead of doing this, we can save a line and just cut this out and set that to the require. So that's what I'm going to do. And the first thing that we're going to bring in here is going to be the GraphQL object type. Okay, so we're going to bring that in because when we have different resources like projects, clients, users, blog posts, whatever it is, you want to create a type for all of those. So let's start off with our client type. So we'll say client type, and we're going to call this, no, we'll just use that. Yeah, so we're going to do client type as a variable, and the convention is to use uppercase. And then we're going to set that to this new GraphQL object type that we brought in from GraphQL. And this is going to take in a couple different fields, a couple different values. First is going to be the name, which I'm going to call client. Then we have fields, which is actually going to be a function that returns an object. So that's what this is. It's a function, arrow function. It's returning an object. And then here is where we want to put our fields. So the first is going to be an ID, but I'm actually going to use the GraphQL ID type. So we do need to bring that in up here. We'll say GraphQL ID. And then I'm also going to bring in GraphQL string. You can see all the different options here. But yeah, I'm going to bring in string. And the other fields we're going to have are going to be a name. So we'll go ahead and do that, an email, and a phone. Now, to make a query, so let's say we want to get a client by the ID, then we need to create down here our root query object. So let's say const and say root query and set that to a GraphQL object type, just like we did above. And the name for this, we're going to set that to root query type. And then this also is going to take in fields. Okay, now this fields is actually, it's going to be an object, and these fields are going to pertain to queries. So for instance, if we create one called client, most likely that's going to be to fetch a client. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say client, and let's set that to an object, and that's going to take in a type of client type, which we just created up above. All right, now if we're getting a single client, we're going to need to know which client are we getting, so we'll need to pass in an ID. So this is actually also going to take in args, okay, so arguments, and it's going to take in an ID, and then we want to set that to the type of GraphQL ID. All right, so when we make our query from graphical or from Apollo within React, within our front end later on, we'll be passing in the ID that we want for this client. And then where we have our return, whatever we want to respond with, that's going to go in something called a resolver. So we have this resolve function that's going to take in a parent value, and arguments. Okay, I'll just call this parent. So parent and args. And here is where we actually want to return our data. Now, later on, we're going to be using MongoDB with Mongoose. So what we would put here is our Mongoose function to get a single client. Right now, we're just dealing with a simple file with some arrays. So this, what GitHub Copilot is telling me to use, I'll use that because it's just taking the client's array. It's calling the find function, which is a high order array method. And it basically just loops through and it finds where the client ID is equal to the args, the ID here that's passed in. Okay, now to be able to use this query, we need to, first off, we need to export this as a schema. So down here, we're going to say module.exports, and we're going to set that to a new GraphQL schema. So if we look down here, we should have that option right here. So new GraphQL schema, and that's going to take in an object with query, and we want to set query to our root query, which is this right here. Okay, and then we got to make sure that we bring this in, this GraphQL schema. It looks like it was auto imported. All right, and this list gets pretty long, especially if you're doing everything in a single file, but it's all stuff that we need. So now that we've exported our schema and we're including it right here, we can now make a request to our GraphQL endpoint, and we can do that with this graphical tool. We do have it enabled because we are in development, so this is setting that to true. So to access that, remember we're running on port 5000, so what we can do is just do HTTP localhost :5000 and then /GraphQL. Okay, and then that gives me this graphical tool where we can basically test out our queries. This is kind of like Postman when you're working with a REST API. And I want to make this a little bigger so we can see it. And these are all just comments. We can get rid of this. So let's make our query to get a single client. So what I should be able to do here is say, well, if we're making a query, we need to just have these opening curly braces. And as soon as I type a C in, you'll see I'll get this drop down because it knows what is available as far as our schema goes. And it knows we have a client query. So I'm going to say client. And then remember, we have to reference an ID, meaning we have to pass in an ID argument. So here, as soon as I put in I, it shows us ID. And let's say we want to get the ID of 1. And if we look at our data, so the data we're working with right now is just this sample data, and we're working with clients, and they all have an ID. So you can see Tony Stark has an ID of 1. So let's pass in that, and then we can open up our curly braces and just say what we want to get back. Let's say we just want to get the name back. So I can either hit this play button, or I can do a command or control enter. That's going to run the query, and you can see that I get back Tony Stark. All right, and I only get the name, right? I don't get the email or anything like that because I did not request that. That's the big difference between GraphQL and a REST API is I can get only the data that I want. I don't need a bunch of crap, I don't get a bunch of crap that I don't need. If I do want to get the email, then I can do that. I can get the email and I can get the phone, run that. I can also get the ID. So if I go up here, we'll say ID, run that, and you'll see now I get all the data. Typically with a REST API, you would just get all the data no matter what. And you would have all these different endpoints to hit. In this case, we're always working with that one GraphQL endpoint. So I think what we should do next is in our schema, I think we should create a query to get all clients. All right, so to do that, we're going to go into the root query here, and right after client, actually let's put it before it. We'll do clients, plural, and set that to an object. Make sure you put a comma there. So as far as the type goes, we're not going to set it to client type on its own because it's actually a list. It's a list of client types. So what we're going to set it to is GraphQL list, and the type of items that are in this list are going to be client type. So we do have to bring that GraphQL list in. So let's do that. We'll say GraphQL list. Okay, so that's the type. Then we don't need any args because we're just getting all clients, so we don't need to pass in an ID. So we can just go ahead and add our resolve function here. Takes in parent and args, and we're just going to return clients. So we're basically just returning the array, simple as that. So now let's save that, and let's go over to graphical, and let's see, we're going to, instead of passing in an ID like that, we're going to change this to clients, plural, and then put in here whatever we want, whatever data we want. I'll just get everything, and we'll click play. And it just has a red line because it didn't refresh the page. If I refresh, that line will go away. So now you can see what I get is this, we get a data object with a client's array. And that array has every single client object inside of it with all the fields. If I just wanted to, let's say, get the name, so an array of client names, then we could do that. All right, so very cool. Now let's do the same thing with projects. All right, so I'm going to go back to our schema, and just like we have client type, we're going to need a project type. So we can actually copy this to make this a little quicker, and let's paste that in. This is going to be our project type. We want to change this to project type, and the name is going to be project. Actually, it should be an uppercase P. And then as far as the fields, we are going to have an ID. We are going to have a name. We're not going to have an email for a project, but we're going to have a description, which is going to be a string. So we'll just change